everyone. Good morning. Am I on? Yes?
Hi, welcome to Microsoft. Welcome to the Microsoft Innovation and Policy Center. I'm Portia Wu. I lead the federal policy team here. We're delighted to have you. Our center here is a place for community, for conversations at the intersection of technology and policy. And we're delighted to convene today this conversation, and I'm sure it will be a lively and interesting one about the future of work. Today's session is being streamed on Facebook Live, so welcome to those watching online. And for those of you who want to participate in this discussion through social media, the hashtag is #MoreThanOneFOW for Future of Work. So this is part of a broader Future of Work discussion series developed by the National Skills Coalition with support from Deloitte. Thank you. And we're bringing people together in dialogue to discuss policy solutions in the changing world of work. There was a first conversation already, it's a series, so there was a first conversation already at the National Skills Coalition Skills Summit a few weeks ago. That's available for viewing online. That was talking about the impact of technology, changing technology on different groups of workers. Today's discussion is going to talk about varying impacts across industries. And so we're delighted to be joined by experts from healthcare, retail, manufacturing, and technology. I do want to say this is an issue of particular interest to Microsoft. We know that technology is changing the world of work, and a lot of those technologies are ones where Microsoft is a leader. Artificial intelligence, cloud computing, they're central to that change, and we know they're going to stand to accelerate the pace of other existing industry trends, such as automation. We also know from past history that automation and technological change creates new opportunities and new jobs. But the big question is, and I know probably a lot of you have been to dialogues like this, is what are those jobs going to be? What are the technology-enhanced, technology-augmented opportunities going to be? And how can we make sure that all Americans have an opportunity to access those opportunities? So we believe in Microsoft that we as a company and that industry generally have an important responsibility to play in working as a partner with government, with a nonprofit sector, with other stakeholders to help to ensure a smooth transition to this change and profitable economic growth for everyone. A couple key things that I think are really important to us and that we're focusing on. One is making sure that students and workers alike are prepared for these new jobs. We know there's already an existing digital skills gap. We've got about 500,000 open computing jobs in the United States right now, yet only 60-some thousand computer science students graduated into the workforce last year. However, I think we all understand also technology and its importance in the world of work isn't just about sort of narrowly defined computer science jobs. Every job is going to require some level of digital skill today and in the future. And we know that, unfortunately, our current skills training pipeline system isn't really up to the task the way it is today. So while 90% of parents want their child to learn computer science, only about 35% of high schools actually offer computer science. We also need to harness the power of data to understand what skills are needed, how we can connect workers to those jobs and those skills. As the pace of change accelerates, we know that while government sources of data are important and good, we need to have faster real-time information about what's happening in the labor market. We need to think about modernizing labor standards and the social safety net, existing government training and retraining programs, as well as our higher education system. How can we make sure all those systems are working together and are responsive to the needs of this fast-changing economy and labor market? And then finally, ensuring access to training and job opportunities. Participating in this new era, and there are a lot of potential barriers here. I think I want to just focus on one for a minute that's super important to Microsoft. Participating in this new era, we all know that's going to require access to the internet. That's sort of the electricity of today. Yet there are at least 25 million Americans, more than 19 of them living in rural communities who do not have access to broadband connectivity. And that's probably a lowball estimate. There are probably a lot more. That's why Microsoft is so proud of our Rural Airband Initiative. We announced that in 2017. We're committed to partnering with broadband partners to make sure we extend broadband access. We had set a goal of reaching 2 million Americans. We actually have now expanded that to reaching 3 million by 2020, and we've made a huge amount of progress. We're already serving over 200 rural and underserved counties. So, but that's a huge effort, and again, something we're going to have to do more on. Excuse me for a second. Sorry. So I just touched on a couple things. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that actually we thought about this a lot, and we put out this book about a year ago called The Future Computed, and we've got a whole chapter in here on the future of work. So if you're interested in hearing more about our ideas, I'll be talking about them today, but I'm also excited. I would love for people to take a close look at this and see more about Microsoft's thoughts in this area. This is a challenging area. It's going to require a really strong cooperation and collaboration across industry, nonprofit, higher ed, workforce training, public sector. So really, who better to convene this conversation than the National Skills Coalition, who has been doing this for many years and is really an expert at bringing together people to think about policy at the federal and state level. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Andy Van Clunen, the CEO of National Skills Coalition, and he will introduce the rest of the panel. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Portia. Thanks, everybody, for being here with us this morning in Washington, and welcome to the folks who are here with us online. So I'm Andy Van Clunen. I'm the CEO of National Skills Coalition, and just a little bit about us. We're a national coalition of a range of stakeholders who've been trying to solve this issue about how we get more people into open skilled jobs in our economy. So business leaders, labor leaders, community colleges, community-based organizations, workforce boards, a range of folks are trying to figure out how we can get everybody the skills they need to compete and prosper in a changing economy. And so obviously having a conversation about the future of our economy and the future of work is essential and day-to-day concern for many of the stakeholders that we're working with on the ground. We're a policy organization, so we particularly want to talk about where it is that government can play a more effective role as a partner with industry and these other stakeholders to start to deal with some of those challenges. Now, I know a lot of folks here have been part of future work conversations where there tends to be a lot of debate about the scale of the change and the number of jobs that are going to be impacted. We're not going to get into that today, other than to say, like, I think we all agree that there's going to be some big changes. Even if you agree with what seems to be a kind of a consensus number around the 60% or so of current jobs that are going to be changing pretty significantly in terms of the digital content, that's over 90 million jobs, 90 million working people in our current economy. And so what we want to do is we want to look at how it is that those bigger changes are going to be impacting today different types of industries, because those impacts are going to be felt differently, and the workers in those industries have different abilities to be able to retrain to stay ahead of that technological curve. And so while 90 million workers is going to require a robust government response, it is only going to be effective if we're developing it in concert with the needs of particular industries who are dealing with their own particular operational constraints, the composition of their workforces, and what have you. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today. I have a great panel here with me. I'm going to introduce them shortly, but let me just do just one more kind of level set on the kinds of issues that I hope we get a chance to talk about today. Daniel Bustillo and I wrote an article last year called Factory Robots versus Mom's Caregiver, as a way to kind of talk about what the distinction is between how we have tended to think about the future of work within the context of the manufacturing industry versus the folks that he's working with in the healthcare industry, particularly in acute and long-term care, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I wanted to use the manufacturing industry as an example of where in the past we have had a pretty robust federal response to changing technology situations within a particular industry. Now, manufacturing has been dealing with technology for decades. If we go back to the third industrial revolution, which was somewhere between the 1970s and the 1980s, and even prior to that, like, industry was rapidly trying to bring in technology to stay more competitive internationally with other manufacturers overseas. Both worker representatives and industry representatives were working together to figure out how to bring that technology onto the shop floor. In the 1980s, we had the creation of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership here in Washington at the Department of Commerce, at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was trying to figure out how to diffuse that technology to more smaller manufacturers so that they could stay competitive. Since then, we've had successions of presidents who have made it a priority to train more manufacturing workers. So under President Obama, we had a plan of trying to train 1 million new manufacturing workers or current workers to stay ahead of the technological curve in manufacturing. Certainly the manufacturing workforce is of importance to President Trump. So we've had a great amount of interest from the federal government, both Congress and the administration, in terms of how it is that we can help manufacturing workers deal with changing technology over decades. But we have many other industries that are now going to be impacted in a dramatic way, industries that are employing more people actually than we have manufacturing workers in this country. So about 19 million workers in healthcare, about 16 million in retail, compared to around 11 or 12 million workers in manufacturing. But we really have not had much of a policy conversation about how it is that we're going to deal with the technology challenges of those particular industries. And so if you look again, like say healthcare and manufacturing, I mean, both of them have the kinds of tasks that will be those that are going to be most readily impacted by automation and artificial intelligence, repetitive motion tasks in a controlled environment. But how that applies to creating physical product versus how that applies to caring for human bodies is very different in terms of how it is that you think about the training and the incorporation of that into those newer jobs or changing jobs. The composition of those two workforces is dramatically different. Because of the investments in technology and manufacturing over decades, the skill levels of manufacturing workers has been rising over the decades. And in fact, it's the technology and the robots that we've been trying to use as a way to attract new workers who otherwise wouldn't think that manufacturing was a job for them into the sector, particularly for younger people who thought that manufacturing was a dying industry, that in fact, it's a highly technology-infused industry now, and trying to get higher skilled workers and students into that sector. Long-term care, community-based caregiving is a very different level of skill, and we'll talk a little bit about that with Daniel, about how those workers would be able to take on new training to help them stay ahead of technology. The racial and gender compositions of those workforces are very different. The wage levels and where it is that wages are responding to inputs of technology are very different. In manufacturing, those wage levels are rising. Those with the higher skills within manufacturing are making much more money. There is some concern about lower skilled parts of manufacturing where wage levels are there. But there's not been much rise at all in wages for healthcare workers. And so how is it, when you think about the efficiencies of automation, how is it going to play out very differently within caregiving versus how it is in manufacturing? So that's all pretty obvious, right? We know manufacturing is different than healthcare. But the policy conversation to this date in terms of the future of work has not kind of picked up on how it is that we need to have a more nuanced set of policies to respond to these different types of environments. And in fact, though in the past we've had consistent concentration on manufacturing as an industry as a whole that required some kind of national response, we actually don't have a lot of that in other parts of our national workforce policy and planning. We do have the MEP still, although sometimes it's year to year whether or not it's actually going to get funded, even in this day and age with all of now that we're into the fourth industrial revolution. And we really don't have industry-level strategies for healthcare, retail, all the other industries that are going to be impacted by some of these changes. Interestingly, other countries with which we compete internationally, for whom industrial-focused policy is kind of a part of how they think about their labor and economic planning, that's something that they've already been doing for quite a while. And the World Economic Forum recently put out a study talking about the U.S. workforce and the impacts on technology on the U.S. workforce and what role companies are going to play in trying to keep workers ahead of of those changes. And they estimated that, and we have lots of individual companies, including some who are represented up here today, who are making significant investments in their workers, several million of them total. Right now, the Council for the American Worker, which was created by the Trump administration, is being staffed out of the Department of Commerce, had asked companies to make pledges about the number of workers that they're going to retrain. And we're talking about millions of workers of commitments from individual companies in the U.S. But all told, the estimate by the World Economic Forum is that might cover 20 to 25% of the reskilling need for the number of workers that we're talking about that are going to be impacted. But they said, if companies work together as an industry, there would be cost savings that probably could cover half of the entire reskilling effort. So that if we had an industry strategy, private investment would cover about half of it, government investment could cover the other half of it, and we could actually come up with some solutions around these issues. But we first need to make a decision that we want to have industry-directed policies as opposed to just business or firm-directed policies. So that's part of the things that we're going to talk about today. What are the differences between these industries? How are companies within these industries dealing with these technology changes? And how are we thinking about industry-wide strategies as one of the responses to some of these challenges? So let me introduce you to our expert panel who's going to help us talk through those issues. Immediately to my left is Daniel Bastillo. So Daniel is the director of the Healthcare Advancement Program, or HCAP. It's a national organization of SEI unions and healthcare employers who are developing innovative career pathways and education models for frontline healthcare workers in a variety of settings: hospitals, home and community-based care. He also serves as vice president for the HCAP Education Association, a related organization comprised of a network of industry-based healthcare training partnerships. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andy and NSC.
And I'll do the rest of the introductions, and
Sure.
then you can jump right into it. I'm ready to go.
We're ready to have the conversation.
Next to Daniel is Angie Cooper. Angie's Senior Director of Global Public Policy for Walmart, the world's largest retailer. Angie manages Walmart's policy team, who is responsible for legislative and regulatory strategy, political development, and reputation management for the company. She also just finished co-organizing an event that I attended down in Bentonville, Arkansas, the Bentonville Conference on American Life, where a range of family and community economic being and future work issues were addressed. So we're looking forward to talking more about that. Thanks, Angie, for being here.
Thank you.
Next to Angie is Robert Chiappetta. Robert's the Director of Government Affairs at Toyota Motor North America, where he's responsible for enhancing the company's reputation and advancing its legislative agenda with members of Congress and the administration, focusing primarily on workforce, labor, and foreign direct investment issues. Robert, thanks for joining us this morning. And you've all met Portia Wu, who's the Managing Director of U.S. Public Policy here at Microsoft. Many folks here know that Portia has an extensive career in the public, nonprofit, and private sectors on a wide variety of labor issues and policies, including job training, wage standards, work and family policy, immigration, pensions and retirements, and worker safety. And she was also a leader on these issues under the Obama administration. She was Assistant Secretary of Labor for the Employment and Training Administration and also had led some of these issues while working in the White House. Portia, thanks for hosting us and thanks for being here. Later, we're going to be joined by our series sponsor, Deloitte, who's been helping us think through some of these issues. Amy Titus, she's the Managing Director in the Human Capital Division at Deloitte, where she focuses on providing talent, learning, organization transformation, and change solutions for the firm's clients, as well as leading its government and public services learning solutions practice. So Amy, we'll be hearing from you later. All right, but let me turn now. Daniel, I'm going to give you your chance. I know you're chomping at the bit. So let's just talk a little bit, just kind of brass tacks, about what are the technology changes that are currently being considered for hospital and home and community-based caregivers, and what impacts are those going to have on the working lives of the people that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis?
So I'll say it again. Thank you, Andy and NSC, for hosting us, and thank you, Portia and Microsoft, for hosting us here today. So when I think about healthcare and answering the brass tacks question, so I'm going to talk about three particular things. One is telemedicine, right? I always joke that I feel as if every time I attend an event that talks about the future impact of technological change in healthcare, it feels as if all our healthcare is going to be delivered through our iPhones moving forward, right? That's always what we're told. And there is some truth to that, right? So telemedicine will enable us to have more patient, consumer, client contact, whether it's through a tablet, through a phone. There will be much more interaction, and there will be much more remote caregiving. One, AI is the second. So when I think about AI, thinking about, and Andy sort of mentioned this up front, when we think about where there are large data sets, so I think about diagnosis as an example, radiology, it just makes sense. We know that there will be impacts related to AI. The third, robotics. Robotics, when you think about some routine repetitive tasks, whether it's the delivery of meals, the delivery of linens, transport, things of that sort, there will be some impacts from robotics. I will say this, I do think that just in terms of level setting, because I think it is, and maybe we'll get this, but it is important to level set a little bit in healthcare, right? So sort of thinking about the fact that the best evidence that we have available today in healthcare indicates that while millions of jobs will be impacted, the near-term risk for large-scale elimination of jobs is very remote, right? It will be much more about a repurposing of jobs as opposed to mass elimination of jobs in healthcare. And one other piece I want to add to the conversation is, when I think about the healthcare workforce, I think it's important to level set in healthcare. So we talk about the technological changes, but I think it is important to level set as well. So as Andy mentioned in the organizational description, we have a supply and demand side strategy, really supporting worker aspiration while also meeting employer need across multiple states in the country. And I think that when we think about healthcare, healthcare is an industry that is buffeted by a variety of different changes, right? Healthcare will be the largest major industry in terms of employment in this country by 2026. So an extremely important part of this conversation. We have things such as not only technological change, but we have an aging patient population, right? Increased acuity of that patient population, increased access with insurance expansion. We have changes in the site of care delivery. So thinking about the fact that we're transitioning, hospitals will always exist. And I really appreciate the nuance that you've added to the conversation, because oftentimes when we focus on technological impacts, it is in the hospital setting. But we think about where do we have tremendous growth expected in healthcare? Really in home and community-based settings, right? Thinking about home care workers as an example. So I just want to put that out there, because that's an important piece of the conversation. And I think healthcare, we also have a job quality, and we have a severe occupational crowding issue too, right? And I think from a policy perspective, one of the things that we're concerned about is the interaction between that occupational crowding issue and technological change. So what I mean by that is we know that 27% of healthcare workers around the country identify as workers of color, but if we disaggregate by occupation, home care, it's more like 60%, right? Nurse aides alone, 33% identify as black. Then you move up the occupational ladder, nurses, that number falls to 20%, right? So sort of thinking about the interaction, when I think about the future of work in healthcare, I also think about the future of workers, right? Which is an important piece of the conversation, and sort of thinking about how do we enable some of these labor-enhancing technologies to be able to better support workers, to provide better care, to lower costs, and to create a better healthcare system. And I think the policy choices are in front of us, right? We know that there are a range of options available to us, and it is, I appreciate the advocacy. I think it's an important, we've been down this road during different times in our history, but we have a variety of policy choices in front of us, and we should be intentional about what those policy choices are.
I think it might be, it probably seems logical, but in a future work conversation to hear an industry is talking about the fact that they're still going to be growing in terms of the number of jobs. Even with what's going to be a much more tech-infused workplace. So part of that is just sheer demand, right? It's just aging workforce, things like that, right? Aging population, also an aging workforce. Mm-hmm. But then what does that mean? Like, how is it, if we're looking for efficiencies, how have efficiencies been gained in healthcare up until now, particularly in the less tech-infused parts of it?
Right. It's a good question. Well, I think, and frankly, primarily it's been, and we've talked about this in our Medium piece a little bit, it's sort of, we think about the occupations that we talked about, home care, nurse aides, tremendous turnover as well, right? Thinking about those are difficult jobs with low wages and high turnover as well. So the strategy has not been about using technology as an enhancer. It's really been about cycling through workers and the workforce. Right, so thinking about efficiencies, there are a variety of ways that we can think about efficiencies, right? One of the things that we talk a lot about in healthcare is integration of care. So if we're transitioning to a system whereby most people want to stay in their home, hospitals will always exist, we know this. But would you prefer to receive your care at home or in a hospital, if you had the choice? Most people would say they'd rather stay home. So thinking about creating better integration of care and enabling workers that work in home and community-based settings to have the skills that they need to be able to be more fully integrated members of the care team. And that clearly requires a technological component, right? So sort of thinking about efficiencies like that, where we can have individuals, healthcare workers that have new skills, because we will need new, even for incumbent workers, with the repurposing and the refashioning of our healthcare system, even incumbent workers will need new skills. So we need incumbent workers with new skills, things such as digital fluency, literacy as well is a huge issue. But then also we need new workers coming in that have these skills already. And frankly, right now, even workers who are along a path to enter the healthcare professions, they're not being trained for the settings in which they'll practice or the technologies that they'll use when they practice there as well, even if it's not now, in the future.
Just to give a little bit more on that, so like the average educational level of somebody who's working in home and community-based care is about what now? Like, or what's the range?
So if I think about, that's a good question. I mean, so I think home and community-based care, and I think it differs depending upon geography, right? So I think about home and community-based care, you're talking about a workforce that's primarily women, you're talking about a workforce, large immigrant population as well, oftentimes English not the first language, We're talking about a large percentage of Black and Latinx workers, historically excluded from labor protections too. So I would venture a guess, I don't know the exact statistic, but I would venture to guess that it's somewhere at the high school range
Right,
as well, right?
or less. I
Or
mean,
less.
I think that's true. And so when you're thinking about a reskilling initiative that's going to be helping millions of workers in this new telemedicine, home and community-based care, first have to take into account that many of them are not even reading at high school level. Digital literacy,
Right.
digital fluency is going to be a concern for some of them. Many of them, English is not their first language. So the education intervention is going to be somewhat determined by that structural element of
And the
workforce.
education intervention is massive, right? So sort of thinking about, we have a lot of work to do with the education intervention. So Andy talked about sort of the coalition up front that participates in the National Skills Coalition and sort of working on the policy advocacy that we do. But that is clearly a huge component of this. Sort of thinking, we cannot think about this in a vacuum, as if there are technologies that will be created and that magically workers will then be able to use the technologies as well. There's clearly a huge educational and systemic intervention there as well to be able to support the workforce to incorporate these technologies in a way that is labor enhancing, but also frankly provides better care to patients, clients, and consumers.
So Angie, let's turn to retail now. So in many ways, the retail workforce in terms of composition is not that dramatically different from parts of the healthcare workforce. And not so long ago, Walmart had worked with National Skills Coalition just to do an analysis of the reading and numeracy and digital literacy skills within a range of service sector industries, so healthcare, retail, hospitality. Do you remember what some of those numbers were in terms of kind of like what the composition of that workforce is at those levels and how Walmart has started to kind of deal with that in the context of its own workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. And ditto on the thank you for hosting us and having us here today. Good morning. Thanks for you all being here and talking about this very important issue. The National Skills Coalition has been a great partner, and the work that Annie's referring to is based on the foundation skills in the service sector. It does look at those math proficiency, literacy issues, and then overall just skills that are needed. And what's interesting and not really surprising, I think that we all realize the gaps that currently exist. And when you think about the service sector, people come into the service sector for a variety of different reasons, right? Someone is looking for their first job. Someone is looking for maybe supplemental income. Someone is looking to come to the service sector from a retirement standpoint. And so you have all these different levels that exist within the service sector, which is why I think we see some gaps through some of the work that was done. So the gaps that exist, and the research shows, 20 million out of the over probably 60 million workers in the service sector see about over 60% gap in literacy, over 70% gap in numeracy, and then over 70% gap in just problem-solving skills. So that's significant. That's a large percentage of people that are going into the workforce in the service sector that have these gaps. So we ask ourselves, what do you do to think about those? And you know, at Walmart, we've done a lot. Just for our associate base, we have invested billions of dollars in training and education for our own associates. And we have focused on specifically, hopefully everyone has walked into a Walmart store. And if you look at a Walmart store, a store manager is managing 300 people. An average store is close over $100 million in sales. Just a department manager in one department is like running a very small business. So we have thought about how do we take those gaps that exist with the workforce that is coming to us, and how do we train and educate them to be successful at Walmart, but then also be successful across the sector, whether they stay with us or grow within their careers. And we do see that people that are trained and work at Walmart many times go into manufacturing, many times go into healthcare, because a lot of it is that customer service, frontline interaction that is really important. So some of the training programs that we have implemented, again, invested billions of dollars. One of them is called our academies. And our academies are adjacent or within a Walmart supercenter. And those academies help train and educate our department manager, assistant manager, all the way up to store manager. And what's interesting is we have 200 academies now across the country. We've graduated over 500,000 associates to date. When we started, we were looking at what does the program look like. It's based sort of curriculum-based and on-the-floor training. And just within 2 years, we've invested just how we train using technology. So they're using tablets, they're using VR. Who shops on Black Friday? Like, you can't explain to someone what the craziest shopping day of the year is like. So now they're trained by how you manage that through VR goggles, or they're trained how to stock produce through VR goggles. So it's interesting just within 2.5 years, sort of the technology that's been implemented in that. But we also know, so in-house training is very important. But when you look at those gaps that exist, how do you get people to the next level? So we're proud to be partnering with the Guild organization, and the Guild organization is in partnership with 3 different universities, and we implemented for our associates, they have the ability to receive a college associate's or bachelor's degree in supply chain or business management for $1 a day. And a lot of different companies are doing programs like this. We did $1 a day because we wanted our associates to invest also in what they were trying to do. But then the take rate for these programs, a lot of times it's low. So we're really focusing on how we get people to apply, go through the program. Guild is fantastic because you get assigned a coach, and they show you how to apply. They make sure you're kind of keeping up with what is important to go through the program. And then the second piece of that is the academies training that we've implemented in our stores. You can actually receive college credit. And I think to date, through the training in academies, the college credit is about $270 million in credit today. So we look at those gaps, and I think that's the best way to start. Say, okay, huge gaps. So what is Walmart as an industry we can do to train our associates in-house and then beyond? And then we do lots of discussion across the sector. And we all talk about credentials. We all talk about how you have that mobility. And so that's something that's important. We have to all be talking to each other within industries, but then we have to be talking to policymakers. We have to be talking to our community leaders to make sure that the infrastructure is right, broadband, all of those things are right, so we can actually train and educate our employers for the future.
So let me follow up on that, because obviously, and it's very impressive what Walmart as a company has been able to do, creating the training centers. The sheer number of folks that you've moved through makes you a huge education and training provider. Mm-hmm. But there's many other folks who are working in retail who are not working at Walmart, mm-hmm. right? Working at a lot of smaller stores or other outlets. So how is it that companies that don't have the resources or maybe even the commitment of a Walmart, but those workers are going to be impacted by the same changes in technology that a lot of Walmart's associates are? Like, how is it that we can get those workers and those companies to be able to respond in the same way, perhaps not at scale, but at least can take advantage of some of the things that Walmart has started to figure out for its own workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does start with partnerships like this, with all of us sitting here, all of you sitting in the room. Where can large companies make investments? And that's something through our Walmart Foundation and our career path we've helped invest dollars into communities to really to spark that for other businesses and other folks that are looking at what are the training and education needs to advance across the entire community that will lift the entire economic base. So Walmart has done a lot in that space, partnering with National Skills Coalition, partnering with companies like Microsoft and others to make sure that where we're located, we're investing not just for our own, but for the entire community. And then, we're starting to think, okay, within 2 years, we've implemented in our academies all of this new technology. how can we think about other small businesses using that same technology when it's not in use at Walmart? Or we have sort of an entry-level training program that teaches you those skills that are about how do you show up to work on time? How do you talk to a customer? You know what? That's the same type of training and curriculum that the flower shop needs, that the local, the local Main Street shops need. So we're doing a lot of having a lot of conversations with those community leaders to how do we share cross-functional? Because it can't just be Walmart Foundation providing grants, Microsoft providing grants. It's got to be this broader ecosystem.
Right. So I think that's, and how it is that public policy can play a role in that diffusion, I think is going to be, a big part of the conversation,
Absolutely.
I hope, here in Washington. So we'll come back to that a little
Okay.
bit. Thanks, Angela. That's
Yep.
great. So Robert, let's turn to manufacturing. We talk a lot about manufacturing at the top. And just acknowledgement to our partners, Deloitte. Deloitte does a periodic analysis of what the manufacturing workforce needs are out there, and its latest version from 2018 says that both with increasing digitalization of the manufacturing workforce and the demographics of retirement and what have you, there's probably going to be about, over the next several years, like 2.5 million jobs, skilled manufacturing jobs, that are going to go unfilled unless we make some other changes in how it is we're thinking about preparing that pipeline. So that's a huge challenge. So you're at Toyota. Toyota is often held up as kind of a world leader, very forward-thinking, both in terms of how it is that has applied both its new automation and technology, but also its lean production processes. You made me make sure that it's the so-called Toyota production system. All right, so there's a lot of technology that has gone into how it is that Toyota as a manufacturer has achieved new efficiencies and scale. But that's not at the exclusion of how it is that you're thinking about human beings and labor and where it is that that's part of your new manufacturing system. So I'm curious, how is it that Toyota is balancing those two issues?
So thank you, Andy, and thank you, Microsoft, for hosting as well. It's great to be here. So this is something that has always been the case at Toyota, really from the outset. One of the most important manufacturing executives in the history of Toyota is a man named Taiichi Ohno. He's responsible for sort of codifying the Toyota production system. And he talks a lot and has helped the company understand how important human capital is, as well as machine and robotic power. And so, if you look at our company compared to other companies, particularly in our industry, historically we have had fewer robots on our shop floor than others. And we've always placed a high emphasis on people and what they bring to the equation as well. So when we're looking at automation and trying to integrate technology into the manufacturing process, obviously the focus is on the customer and what value we can bring to the customer. And there are lots of ways to do that in cooperation with people. And so, for example, a manufacturing line is a fixed asset. It starts at one place, it ends at another, and you can fit so many pieces along that line. And if you can introduce technology to reduce the amount of space, you could put more pieces on the line. You can produce more vehicles, and that doesn't necessarily lead to less people. In fact, in some cases, it may lead to more people. Another factor might be. You could implement a robot or a machine to help a person do the job that they do. So maybe it's something that would reduce a pressure or a manual task, and that would lead to less injury or less fatigue on the person, and that would create higher outcomes, better quality for that person. So that's some of the ways in which sort of technology and people come together to create better outcomes, not necessarily one at the expense of the other. It is the case that sometimes a machine or a robot can do something and eliminate a portion of the work that the person does. But at Toyota, what we would normally do is try to find other work for that person to do, other ways for that person to add value. Again, this goes back to the very beginnings of Toyota. A person obviously comes with a lot of history, a lot of knowledge, a lot of skill, and you wouldn't want to just push that person out the door. just because you've got a new tool, a new machine. You'd want to integrate that person, keep that person integrated into the process so as to create more value for the company.
So I think that would be, I would dare say, if you look at almost any future of work publication, often it is the picture of the empty shop floor with the colorful robotic arms, and there's not a human being in sight. So obviously that picture wasn't taken in a Toyota factory. If you're actually adding people to the line, I think that would be a surprise for many folks who think that there's not, that the role of human beings, skilled human beings in labor as part of an automating manufacturing process. I don't think that gets talked about enough, particularly when we're talking more about everybody who's going to be losing a job in a workerless economy. That in fact, we're going to have a lot of people who do and can be working in this environment, but it's going to require a whole new investment in their skills in order for them to do that. So I know, so maybe you'll answer this question as a follow-up, because I know that Toyota in the communities here in the US, where it has a large manufacturing footprint, has been trying to figure out how to build out the pipeline of local folks who could now play some of that role on the shop floor. Could you talk a little bit about what you've been doing in some of those areas?
Yeah, just so I'm not misleading, there are parts of the Toyota plant and shop floor where there are just machines.
Sure.
And like welding, for example, and you usually see a lot of pictures of these arms and sparks going all over the place.
Right.
But again, if you look at what happened over time, typically those people were redeployed in other places and used in different ways to, again, create more value. And so in terms of partnerships and the skills that we are looking for in our workforce, with new machines and new robots, obviously, someone's got to maintain them, someone's got to repair them, tweak them, reprogram them for different purposes, and so the skill set is definitely changing for the manufacturing worker. And the unfortunate reality for everyone is that the education sector is not moving as quickly as we are in this area, and so we have had to step in and figure out a way to ensure that the pipeline is producing what we need. We established a program called the Advanced Manufacturing Technician Program. We started it as we usually do these projects in one place and then bring it to other places. But we started it in Kentucky, and we kind of reverse engineered the program. We started with basically, what is it that we're looking for in a graduate? What is it that we're looking for in a person that would be useful to Toyota? And from there, designed a curriculum, and in addition, designed a delivery process that would work best and create the best outcome. And the program's been very, very successful. And we've shifted it to other places where we have manufacturing facilities. And the program is, it's sort of a generic manufacturing program. And we did that because in certain places, certain plants are smaller than others, and we didn't have the ability to create enough need for a community college to make the kinds of investments that we were asking them to do. So it's an open program. And there are currently about 300 different companies that are now part of this network of schools and programs. The program itself is available at 23 different community colleges across the US in 11 different states. We recruit from 8 of those schools. So the majority of schools are actually working with other companies. And what was said is, we're essentially interested in creating a situation where the community around our plant has the kind of network and the kinds of pipelines that support us as well as everyone around us, because labor being so portable, it's very difficult to think of trying to create something that we could control all by ourselves. In addition, obviously, the community college partnership is to meet a very specific need, and it's kind of this, we would consider it a midterm solution because it takes 2 years to produce a graduate. But the root cause goes much deeper, and so obviously, like many of the companies represented here, we invest in programs that go back into the education system. And we just recently announced a few months ago this partnership that completed for us an education pipeline that starts at the kindergarten level and goes all the way through community college to the four-year degree program in one area in Kentucky. And we're not quite sure, but we think that maybe this is the first time this has been created in the US, where you've got essentially investments and partnerships by a company that allows a population in an area to participate in programs that are all connected to careers with our company. So we're excited about that. Now, obviously, we can't do that in every county across the country, and so figuring out how to make that happen elsewhere is a challenge. And obviously, that's where the discussion that's where government comes in and the discussion around public policy begins.
Yeah, so that's great. And so two key takeaways from this is, one is you're developing something based on your industry expertise that now others in industry, other companies who may or may not even be doing business with Toyota are now able to use some of that, and that is now being taken up by some community colleges around the country. And on this really deep investment that you've made in the area of one plant, what is it that we can do to kind of say, how is that replicable, that we have partnerships between companies who are rapidly changing and who are taking seriously the need to invest in people to keep them growing, but recognize that there needs to be an effective set of government or government-sponsored partners around within a community to help complete that partnership. That seems to be two important things that we need to drill down on a little bit. Great. All right, and we'll come back to that a little bit. So Portia, let's turn to you. So Portia, you've been around these discussions for quite a while, and as you have sat through, I'm sure even more than I have, future of work conversations here in Washington, it's not like we don't talk about policy at some of these events, but it still seems to be somewhat confusing for policymakers about where the entry points are. So why do you think that is? Like, what's the challenge that we're facing there?
I think one of the challenges, so thank you, Andy, I love joining this conversation. I think one of the challenges actually is illustrated a little bit by the diversity of the panelists here, right? Every industry has, we have themes in common, but there are things specific to our industry. There are licensing requirements, there are technology, there are process differences, there are customer differences. So there's that. First of all, there's, technology is impacting all of us, but it's impacting us differently. And then I think looking from the government side, the tools are different. And I think this sort of traditional, you go to a place and you're educated in that separate red brick building for a really long time, and then you move to another building maybe and do another 2 or 4 years. That model just doesn't really work or reflect the reality. And I know National Skills Coalition and others have talked about like the reality of who is the new college student, for example, right? It's not typically that 18 to 22-year-old. They still exist right out of high school, but lots of folks who need that additional training and education are older, they're in their mid-20s or later, they're parents, they're already working, and I don't know that our systems, one, have adjusted to meet that new reality, and also we're not terribly good from the policy maker, government side of having multiple systems work together. So the K through 12, higher ed, workforce training system. I see some of my old colleagues here from the Department of Labor. Getting those to work together is challenging because the funding's different. You've got different statutory directions. How do you coordinate best, and how do you move quickly? It's hard to change. I mean, looking even at the hiring in the tech industry, the things we were posting for 8 or 10 years ago are completely different than what we're posting for today and what we're looking for. So how can government and policymakers keep on top of that change, and how can we have a system that's flexible enough to meet those changing demands? I think that's really difficult.
And there is tension as we have conversations here in DC about what is the role, whether industry is playing a role as a guider or as a beneficiary, and I think it depends on where you sit, how you see these issues. But this does sometimes seems to be a tension about when you're trying to bring industry to the table, particularly in more traditional education settings where there's concerns about whether or not we are turning our education systems into just worker production systems. How do we kind of break that part of the challenge?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of us have been involved in different sector industry partnerships, right? And we've talked about that, but that itself is a tension of saying you have federal direction and funding, but actually these decisions are intensely local and the partnerships are intensely local. And as much scale as you can get from the internet. I think we all understand having that trust level and that local investment is always going to be key to driving workforce forward. I do think continuing, and this is where I think data and other things can be helpful, is showing, look, these partnerships can have this impact. And it's really exciting to hear about the different models that some of my colleagues on the panel are working on, and just really show how it can be fruitful and can help workers work not only at our companies, but move on to other places in the industry or economy. Because I think selfishly as companies, we always want people to be with us and stay with us and grow with us, but we also understand there may be other opportunities, and we all benefit if we can create workers with sort of that multiple tools in the toolbox set of skills. So I do hope that data, that's got its own challenges, I know, but data, information, and sharing what's being done, and maybe thinking about how can, at the federal and state level, how can innovations be funded and supported with the appropriate amount of transparency, accountability on the back end. And maybe we need to measure some different things than we've been measuring. Some of these sort of cross-cutting skills, having a job today and the wages today is super important, but looking at people's long-term growth and earnings potential is also really important. And that's something I think we haven't been as good at figuring out how to gauge.
Right. I'd love to come back to this data policy question, but let me ask you just one more on, since you're here now at Microsoft and the tech sector in general. So this is a sector that kind of is, you are all also dealing with the same kind of pipeline, finding qualified people set of issues that most employers on this panel are dealing with or represented. You're also sometimes seen as the ones who are creating the disrupting technologies that are having an impact on workforces in other industries. So you both have a need, you're seen as part of the problem. What is the role that the tech community could play in some of these conversations moving forward? That's kind of distinctive, maybe.
Well, first of all, thanks, Andy. I think that's why we put out the Future Computed last year, was to say we understand the bigger picture. It's not just about us, selling a product or selling technologies that can help people revolutionize their workforce. We're seeing the bigger policy picture. We see the things that need to change. Labor laws and social safety nets that are outdated, rethinking how we provide training and education. I think there's an obligation on our part as Microsoft and the technology industry to be thought leaders, to engage those conversations, to think about what our own investments can be. And as I mentioned, that's why we think about it, we're not employing fifth graders who are learning coding today. We might employ them someday, but we understand we have that responsibility to create that talent base, to create the access through expanding broadband. So I do think that, certainly speaking for Microsoft, we feel that broader responsibility. So it's important for us to engage not only in terms of community investments, working with our partners who are using our technology, but also in a policy landscape conversation at the state and federal level.
Well, I want to come back to some policy issues, but I want to give the panel a break here, and I want to invite Amy Titus to come up. So Amy, you've been listening to these folks, and I want to see if you have any reflections based on some of the work that Deloitte's doing on this. And I just want to tell folks in the audience that after Amy's had a chance to share some of her thinking on this, I may ask a couple more questions of the panel, but then I want to give other folks here in the room a chance. So if you've got questions or comments on this conversation, we really would welcome that as well. But Amy, let's turn things over to you to get some of your thinking on it.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank Portia as well from Microsoft, you, Andy from National Skills Coalition, esteemed panelists with all these fascinating comments, and participants in those virtually. I heard 5 themes come out, and I want to go over those and then give you a little bit of a different perspective about how we've been thinking about this, because this is one of our core areas of focus, because we like to solve what we consider our clients' biggest problems, and this is one of them. So first of all, it's just really hits you with the size of this, the gap, the number of people, the jobs, the unknown. So it's just something that, and the need to scale. So that's one theme that came out to me, was just this, and it's not going to go away. It's big. Number 2 was that we need to have, and there is a growing, intense focus on collaboration and partnerships, but in an innovative way, and also very inclusive. So you heard not just maybe with government, industry, but you heard communities and nonprofits, and we need to think about that too in a new way. A third one is one size does not fit all. You all know that. You go on you go on the internet and you shop and you say, no, I want my shoes to have this little bow here, and you get it. So why can't we transfer some of that about one size does not fit all to this dialogue and this pressing need? A third one is what we call tech savvy, but people call knowledge of technology. But I really think we need to think of it about in a new way of human and machine. It's not just, oh, we have to catch up with technology, or technology is driving us. It's how do we get a new way of thinking and a new way of approaching it that is human and machine. I bet you, though, that those 3-year-olds that you see out there playing away on their parents' iPad, they know it intuitively. But that's not everybody. Everybody doesn't have that access. So that is that part of that challenge that we need to address. And the last one is, I want to use the word opportunity. Yes, this is scary, but it is a massive opportunity. And you've probably heard that if you look at this, there's more room for well-being. How do we create that space using automation to allow people to have a better quality of life? And also allowing people to get away from repetitive tasks and be able to focus on value. We talk about that a lot. Why don't we make it happen if we've got these tools? So we need to take leadership on this as we go through this evolution that we're in. And another one is, I won't ask you all to raise your hand or to raise your hand if you're watching this virtually, but you're not just going to have one career. You're going to have multiple careers. As we live longer, this ability to learn new things, to have new challenges and technology changing all the time is going to allow people to have multiple careers and to be able to access what I call continuous readiness to be able to do that. So we have a story that we like to tell at Deloitte, and it's really got 4 levels, and who's adapting most to technology and who's got the most readiness. Well, you've got the individual, and I know that a lot of people don't have access to internet, but I bet most of them have a phone. Most everybody does. And so they're doing all kinds of things of human and machine in their own personal life. And then you go and you hear about some of these organizations, and they're doing very creative things. And then we go to the government, which we know is slower about it. And you all heard about the challenges for a policy to be able to help create what I call this opportunistic future, this opportunity, this wealth that we could bring through this for the future. And so we don't say that people suddenly stop being smart when they aren't looking at their phone at home or somewhere. We just need to figure out how to make these organizations and government policy fit into this and adapt to this new world. And it's really, there's another question too, and it goes back to this whole ecosystem we're hearing about schools. What we are talking about now is, yes, there's skills with technology, with robots, with AI, with automation. These skills to be using them are going to be constantly changing, morphing, and we need to develop people at all ages in all these different industries that have what we call enduring human capabilities to be able to adapt and learn. So what is needed partially in schools and to be developing people, and what are these enduring human qualities? And you heard some of this. Angie touched on it, and some of the other panelists. Things like curiosity, empathy, problem solving, social skills, and all these kinds of things that are basic that automation can't do. And so how do we be fostering that and nurturing that in people so that they're prepared, so as they get tech savvy, they're going to be able to live and adapt in ways that are absolutely needed. So I just want to finish up around this question of policies. How do you create a tech-savvy policy is my question. But they need to be intentional, and I wanted to say that policies in a new way, we were talking about approaching this in a new way that allow for nimbleness and agility, and something that again, we call building in continuous readiness at all levels, anytime in your career, not just when you're in school. And I like what Portia said about the building. You go from one building to the other, but at all times and in new ways. And as we know, one size does not fit all, and so we have to build for that. So those are my comments, Andy.
That's great,
Back
Amy.
to
Thank
you.
you. Let me and folks may come back to you, but let me, as you're sitting back down, let me just ask you one last question about on this issue about continuous readiness. I mean, we often hear this term of lifelong learning, right? It's always part of the conversation around what we could be doing to create more opportunities for that. It does kind of make it sound like that's on the individual to kind of figure out. Like, and sometimes we might be able to create some opportunities for that to take place. Do you think that that's going to get us to scale, where we're really waiting for individuals, hoping that they have the time and the resource and to be able to do that on their own? Or do you think that we need to have a different way that we're helping people develop that continual readiness in some ways?
Well, I think it's multifaceted, and those who have stronger levels of curiosity are going to be doing that individually. But I really think, again, like we talked about this whole concept of an ecosystem, there needs to be multiple ways to be generating continuous readiness through programs, through supporting individuals, through incentives, lots of different ways. And why did we not call it lifelong learning? It's because people tend to think about learning going back into a classroom. And we want to get away from that. We want that to be part of it, but we want to think about it in many multiple ways. Building readiness into the actual flow of work is one way to address that. So I think there's a lot of creative possibilities in this concept that we are just starting to crack open.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that even the conversation that we've been having with these folks today, the idea about learning, if people are learning in part to stay on the job or to figure out their next job, learning in the context of work seems to be incredibly important. And to scale it, we need effective government policy, but we need to be working with industry to kind of figure out how to make that land and how to take some of those technical skills or digital literacy skills and how they apply to the particular work environments in which folks are. And that's it's hard to create a laboratory where we do that sometimes, where we try to kind of create situations where this is what it feels like to do this job, but it's much better to be doing the job and learning while you're on the job. And how we can do that, I think, is going to be a real challenge. So let me just ask thanks, Amy. So let me ask a couple quick questions, and then I want to give our folks here in the room a chance. Daniel, I want to talk to you about, part of what you've been doing is obviously you're building through SEIU, through its local unions, have been building these partnerships of worker advocates, education training providers, multiple employers. And so in some ways, you're doing that on your own, but I know that HCAP has an interest in where public policy could make that easier to do or more scalable or bring that to other places. Could you talk a little bit about how it is that government policy could be an enabler of those kinds of, different types of industry partnerships?
Right. So, and I'll tie this to what Portia said, because Portia also mentioned industry partnerships. So in essence, we are a network of networks, a network of industry partnerships, right? So a network, in our context, labor management partnerships, but particularly important in healthcare, where I think about the fact that what is the role that an intermediary plays in healthcare, right? Healthcare, there are no 50-state healthcare employers, right? We have a lot of small and mid-sized firms in healthcare as well. This is really geographically, this is a regional level discussion, and the work needs to happen there. So sort of thinking about bringing multiple partners together to sort of parse out where are we now, where are we going. I'll give two specific examples. When I think about, and tie it to some of the other conversation, when I think about the fact that, so access has been brought up here in terms of internet access. One of the things that we've been doing in some of the innovations, we've been working with home care workers in terms of thinking about what are the micro-credentials or otherwise that home care workers could access. I think the delivery of that content and how it's delivered is also really critical. So what we found out is that even if home care workers don't know how to use a computer necessarily, everybody knows how to use the smartphone, right? So what are the innovations in that space? So I think seeding some of that innovation is really important. I'll give another specific example. So this is a labor enhancer, but it's also a quality of care enhancer. So in Washington State, there's a platform called Carina, which is a matching platform, right? So it connects individual providers, it connects home care workers with potential clients, and it's online. Better for clients because you have access to, you can see the qualified caregivers. Better for the workers because many workers have limited number of hours that they have access to. So they have a space where they can actually connect and see that. So I think the seeding of that sort of innovation But I think, frankly, also in terms from a policy perspective, one of the things that we don't oftentimes talk about is there's a host of wraparound services and supports that industry partnerships provide that are just as critical, right? So one thing is the content, the delivery of the content, the access to it, but then there are other things. We're talking oftentimes, especially if we're talking about incumbent workers, we're talking about working parents. If you're in a rural area, access to educational systems might not exist. You know, I have a slight disagreement about I think we oftentimes do put the onus on the individual. So I'll give you an example. One of the particular pathways we like to talk about in healthcare is CNA to LPN. Oftentimes what that requires, if you're a working CNA, you have to, because of the way the educational
should tell
systems are
folks
set up.
what CNA
Sorry, certified nurse aide to licensed practical nurse. Because of the way those educational systems are set up, if you're a working certified nurse aide with a family to support as well, the educational component requires you to go to school full time. So what you have to do, and I encounter healthcare workers around the country that try to do this all the time, you have to go to school full time, then work 2 doubles on the weekend in order to maintain some sort of wage and benefit level. Like how many? I know that I could not do that. I'm very upfront about that. How many of us in that room could do that? Right. So sort of thinking about policy to seed innovations, but also thinking about the preponderance of supports that are provided by industry partnerships. I think we clearly need to have more of a focus on that.
That's great. Portia, let me ask you a question about some work that you did under the administration, which I know we continue to kind of grapple with to this date, which is we've talked a lot about how jobs are going to change. Robert was good to remind us that there are companies that are trying to hang on to folks when their jobs are eliminated, but there are many folks for whom they may not be working at a company where that's an option, right? And so the concern about the number of people who are going to be losing jobs at their current firm and what we're going to do to help them get reemployed, we're currently still dealing with a set of policies around reemployment in this country that, some of them date back to the 30s, some of them date back to the 70s. These certainly are not 21st century worker adjustment policies. These were things that you were trying to deal with under the last administration. Like, what is it that we need to do to think about reemployment policy at a scale that we think might be necessary as these changes take place throughout the workforce?
So that's a great question, Andy, and this is sort of putting on my hat back when I was at Department of Labor and in the last administration. I do think, you look at the unemployment insurance system, and something we said a lot when I was in that capacity was, look, people want that support, right? Unemployment is a safety net. It helps people find the next job. But maybe just thinking about it as here's some money while you look isn't the right way to think about it. It's also how can we assess what you've got, what you're suited for? How can we help match you with a better opportunity, or figure out if you've got a gap, how can we help you improve and get the skills that are needed that you want to move into something better? And I think we have different programs, but in the past we had thought about, okay, there's that income support piece over here, then there's training over there, and that's really limited. It might depend on why you were laid off. Did you lose your job because of trade, in which case we have more robust services. If you lost it for some other reason, we might not be able to help you. Or do you have certain barriers? And just sort of thinking about it, stepping back now, I think, of course, you want to target federal resources to say, help the most needy, help the people who won't otherwise be helped, maybe in a typical industry partnership or other places. But at the same time, I also feel like we spend a lot of time doing that assessment and talking about the kind of major change we could be facing now. Maybe we should be spending more time and resources thinking about how can we quickly get a lot more people access to the kind of assessment about the skills they have, and also access to the tools they need to retrain, instead of thinking in a much more limited way about who should have access to those things. I think that's where technology as a tool has a lot of promise, but also you run into the problem of, when you have 1,000 flowers blooming, then that poor individual says, okay, I'm being told I need X. I know in my last job I didn't have the chance to gain these certain digital literacy skills, but now I see 2,000 free offerings on the internet, and I just don't know what to do. I don't know what's most helpful. I don't know what employers in my small town want. So I do think that it can solve some challenges, but we also have to think about how do we have policy structures that help people navigate what their options are.
So making sure that folks have access to those resources, providing some guidance so they can kind of make sense of a set of standards or something that is somewhat predictable in terms of this is the kind of, if it's a certain level of digital literacy that's going to make me more employable, like how do I know that if I take this particular online course that it's going to meet a standard that a bunch of local companies are going to recognize as being part of my new resume? So how is it the government can play a role in some of that? And then all of those other non-tuition, non-instructional things, income support, healthcare support, while folks are making that transition seems to be really essential and hard to do and expensive.
Yes, there's costs.
Yes.
But I think one of the things, and is anyone here from LinkedIn? Oh, there you are. So LinkedIn is a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft, but they also have fabulous data, and they've been doing some terrific projects with different state unemployment systems and thinking about, okay, how do we look at, we typically think of certain services, certain income support. How can we look more granularly at what kinds of services work, right? Like how does helping people understand how to use social networking tools, how does that advance people? How does connecting them to specific training opportunities, how does that advance people? I think there's a lot more to be learned in how do we help people. And unfortunately, there's been a stigma, I think, in the past. We saw this even during the Great Recession of, well, if you're out of work, it must be your fault, really. And that makes it difficult for people to engage in a meaningful way on policy because some people have an ideology that it's about just getting people off the rolls and not really thinking meaningfully about how do we address the labor market needs of our country and then how do we help people get onto really meaningful career paths. And thinking more carefully about that and intentionally about what options people have, how we can support them, I think is really important.
That's great. Robert, I know that Toyota is making a ton of investments in artificial intelligence and automated vehicles and things like that. So I know that the company has some concerns about what impact this could have on some workers. How are you folks thinking about that issue?
Yeah, thank you. So autonomous vehicles, they're coming. They're coming. They're around the corner. In many ways, that technology is already embedded in new cars in bits and pieces. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it will happen probably in 15, maybe 20 years from now. And there's a lot of talk now, though, about how that technology could impact the workforce and how certain occupations could disappear. And that's concerning to us. Obviously, we're trying to bring AVs to market to help make society better by reducing deaths that occur on the road and helping people who can't get from point A to point B on their own to be able to do that. And so this is a challenge that we recognize and we want to do something about. What we've done is we've essentially found other interested partners and created a partnership, a coalition. We call it the Partnership for Transportation, Innovation, and Opportunity, or PTIO. Our website is ouravfuture.org if you're interested in more detail. But it's Toyota and Daimler and Ford, it's Uber and Lyft, it's Federal Express, Waymo, and the American Trucking Association. And we hope to grow our group over time. And we're singularly focused on how this particular technology will impact the workforce. Our current focus is really around understanding this problem, trying to develop more research and more very specific kinds of research around this. We launched back in June last year. We held a session here in DC. We invited some of the top researchers on this topic. We sort of did a survey of what's out there and what it basically says, and we identified gaps in the research. Interestingly, the Department of Transportation just recently, a few months ago, or I should say last year, introduced a request for information for research they want to conduct through the Department of Labor and HHS around this very topic. And so we were able to identify or use those gaps that we had identified and offer that to the Department of Transportation in terms of ideas of where they should be looking. We've had a listening session in Indiana and met with government officials there and industry there as well. We're looking to go to other parts of the country and basically begin this conversation, a very robust and a very in-depth conversation around how this technology will impact the workforce and what we can do about it. The problem is not upon us today, but it will be. And if you think about it, a student entering kindergarten or first grade today is probably going to launch into a career that could involve autonomous vehicles. And that school probably isn't thinking about that right now. And so now is the time to act. Now is the time to try to do something about this.
That's great. Thank you. Angie, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit. We've been talking a lot about industry, but obviously every industry has companies that sit within particular communities. And I would say there almost any community in this country probably has a Walmart in it or nearby it. And I know that this is a particular interest of the company. You recently released a report about where these future of work changes could potentially impact different types of communities around the country. I wanted to see if you want to talk a little bit about that and what that should be doing in terms of thinking, informing our policy discussions here in Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned our presence across the country. So 90% of Americans live within 10 miles of a Walmart store. We're in every community. We see, we feel, we hear what families are thinking and sort of what's impacting American life today. We also employ over 1 million employees or associates of what we call them. So when we think about workforce and how do you plan for the future, we thought, what can Walmart do, obviously, but a lot of the conversations today were about collaboration. So a couple of things before releasing the report, as we were getting started, is we said, okay, there's a lot of data out there, right? There's a lot of fantastic reports, but how can we take it down to the community level? How can we talk about those 90% of Americans that we know and see each and every day? And so we said, we need to create this report that analyzes the impacts that the workforce is going to have, and we did it at the county level. But before we really got started, and we partnered with McKinsey and used their data sets to create this report, but we said, but it has to take all of us, right? And it's really easy to say it has to take all of us, and policy has to be included. And a lot of the conversation around future of work is about rural versus urban, but there's a lot of other things happening in the middle and across the country. So we said, okay, let's go to the policymakers. Let's go to them first and say, what kind of data do you need? What would be extremely helpful to be in this report? And it's not going to solve everything, but it's going to be a start to the conversation. So we went and talked to our friends at the National Governors Association, NCSL, NACO, NLC, U.S. Conference of Mayors, and said, okay, we're going to do this report. What would be helpful? What are your elected officials asking for? And then we went to other partners, think tanks, community leaders, and started working on the report and shared the data along the process with about 30 different stakeholders. So the report is called America at Work, a National Mosaic and Roadmap for Tomorrow. And what we did is we went, again, working with McKinsey, looked at 600 plus data sets focused on innovation, development, economic and social basis, and human capital. And again, we went all the way down to the county level, studied 3,000 counties, and what did we come up with that data set across the country? It's not rural versus urban, and oh my gosh, we're a lot alike than different. And we created this new mosaic map, and I need my prop. It's my fault because I was racing to the airport and I thought it was in my bag. But you can check it out at walmart.com/American Life. But the new mosaic map isn't rural versus urban. It's actually 8 new different archetypes talking about the country. And what's most interesting when you're thinking about policy, I'm looking at our friends at the National Governors Association, one governor in one state is actually looking at 3 to 4 different archetypes. So they have urban areas, they have what we call Americana areas, they have all these different segments. And how do you decide where the funding goes? How do you decide what you do? And so within the report, we pulled out specific case studies, because what we learn, right, you work together, you get things done. Communities do have resiliency, but there are challenges and impacts. So there's policy interventions that are focused within the report. What is also very interesting, again, please check it out, is we've created this new interactive map. So you can go, you can look what county you live in, what county you're from, what county you're working in. It gives all the data points and what makes up that county, population, economic impact, all of that kind of stuff. But then it also says, what is the percentage of technology and the impacts that we're gonna see? And we know, we all have read, not all jobs are gonna go away. You know, about 5% of jobs are going to be impacted. But the ways in which technology is gonna impact and the percentages within each county, it highlights that, and then it talks about how you build that up and how you do have those better trained, better skilled, better paid employees that work across all different sectors. So we're excited about the report. Again, it's a start of the conversation. It has to take all of us, but we're hopeful that it does start a conversation of, okay, what policies are needed? How can a governor deal with all those different segments within one state? And you know, focusing on things that we're talking about, mobility and an economic basis. You mentioned modernizing the safety social net. All of these things that will hopefully start driving action, because it's here, and it's a bipartisan issue, and we all have to get to work to really solve for what's ahead of us.
Absolutely. And so even as we've talked a lot about federal policy today, I mean, we all know that this is a local issue in terms of where it lands. And so we both need federal policies that are looking at the nuances across industry and different groups of workers, but we also need policies that are building the capacity of local groups of decision makers to kind of figure out what is the right combinations of solutions based on what's going on the ground. So again, on that theme of more than one future work, there's a lot of futures of work out there that we need to kind of figure out. So we started a little bit late, but we have at least a few minutes here for questions from folks in the audience. If you could just make it a question, because I think I'm going to have to restate the question just so that the folks online can hear it. So a question would be great. Oh, we do have a mic? Okay, well, still keep it tight. That would be fine. Since I just saw somebody put a hand up in the back, let me, over here. And then maybe we've got time for a couple of questions, and we'll try to get our responses from the panel. Sure, go ahead.
With the increasing use of
And could you introduce yourself too, please?
My name is Lauren. I'm with Congressman Elijah Cummings' office. With the increasing use of AI, where do you see the balance between industry regulation and government regulation, especially in terms of consumer and worker safety and liability?
Great question. Who wants to take a crack at that?
Well, for autonomous vehicles, we are looking to establish sort of federal standards. That's probably our biggest concern and issue right now. Obviously, certain states are looking at doing things individually. You know, it would be much easier and better, and allow us to move much more quickly if there were more reasonable federal standards around those things.
I'll also chime in here. Artificial intelligence means a lot of data use. And so data privacy and how that's protected, I think, is really a central part of this. Microsoft has actually been advocating for a federal data privacy standard for over 10 years now, and it's now starting to really move at the state levels. We also recognize there's certain applications, facial recognition is one of them, where we have to think about transparency, government surveillance, equity, and how there might be, you have to guard against discrimination and non-equitable uses of these technologies. So we have called for federal regulation as a framework. I think we also think that industry self-regulation is incredibly important, in part just because technology moves faster than government can move. And so you need government to set certain baselines, but you also have to have industry thinking internally, what are the appropriate ethical guidelines? What are appropriate uses? So it's important that both happen, I think, in an appropriate way that ideally doesn't stifle innovation, but also can guide it.
And I should say, since you had brought up data policy in the past, it's made me think that we should probably just have a conversation just on this issue. I mean, there are a lot of folks in the tech sector, obviously, large gatherers of data and creating tools that can gather a lot of data. We have public agencies that are also collecting data, administrative data on different programs. They are all regulated by different types of laws. There's questions about how it is that we can integrate private and public data to inform people's decisions on a set of things. It's a whole set of things around policy as it relates to the future of work, as well as a number of other things I think is worthy of its own conversation. So we should come back to that for another session. Let's say we have 2 more questions. I don't want to ignore this side of the room. If I could take one from this side and one from this side. All right, I'm going to go on this side, over here on the left. My left.
Go in the front. Go in the front here.
Okay, we'll go up here to the front. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. My name is Carolyn Jones, and I'm with the Department of Labor. As I'm sitting here thinking about the build out of the internet in which we need to obviously scale up and build out more broadly, what's the intersectionality specifically with AV and people with disabilities as we think about building out AV for the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the, one of the main reasons why we think this technology is so important is giving folks who, again, have a challenge getting from point A to point B. And so, at Toyota, there are sort of 2 systems that we're developing around autonomous vehicles. One we call Chauffeur, and one we call Guardian. Guardian would be where the technology is used to take over for the driver just before an accident to try and prevent an accident. Chauffeur would be the one that I think most people think about when they think about AVs. And in terms of the two goals that we have in terms of reducing deaths on the road and creating more mobility opportunities, Guardian actually does quite a bit to reduce that number for us in terms of deaths on the road, but it's the Chauffeur option that really creates opportunities for folks to engage in the workforce where they couldn't previously, or just have a more robust life. And so for us they're equally as important, and we see sort of that Chauffeur system being the way to provide opportunities for people in the category you're describing.
Just a follow-up question, do you see developers in the disability space to help build out that technology as you think through
Yes.
how this is going to look long-term? And that's what I was specifically trying to get to, is whether or not that population has been incorporated into the equation.
Yeah, so we have a few
So for folks
partnerships.
in here, so the question is, are developers thinking about people living with disabilities as part of the client population for autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, absolutely, and we are partnering with different organizations to create more awareness. Our CEO, our global CEO, Akio Toyoda, talks about Toyota being transformed into a mobility company, not just an automobile company. And his idea is helping people get across the country, across town, and across the room. And so we have a robust robotics program where we're looking at machines or machines other than just a vehicle that can help people with different kinds of challenges. And so there are a number of different products that we may be coming to market soon. Nothing I can announce here or want to announce here, but in terms of the healthcare industry, we're looking very closely at partnering with folks in that industry in ways that would help people in that category.
Great. We're going to take one more question. So did you want to ask your question? Yes.
Just wanted to know for
And introduce yourself.
Oh,
please.
sorry, Alison Knox, Microsoft Philanthropies, and I didn't ask this question to set up Portia to say nice things, I swear. But I just got back from a very, very rural state. I spent a lot of time in rural states, and so I hear the word scale, and spending time in these states, in some places there's absolutely no broadband access at all. And the idea that we can deploy skills through the internet and scale up something in a lot of places in rural America, I don't see it yet. So I wondered, for the employers that don't have a presence in rural areas, how do you think through the responsibility that you have to some of these places that are facing now incredible, incredible challenges?
I already said my thing at the top, Allison, about, I think we see part of our responsibility as expanding rural broadband access. And that's, that's not about selling a specific Microsoft product or a specific workforce we have there. We just understand generally we'll benefit as a company and our economy will benefit by having more people with that access to both skills and to job opportunities. So I think that's part of what we're doing. I will also say sometimes people think of tech as being on the coast, but increasingly, there are developers who can be everywhere. There are data centers that can be everywhere, and there are lots of job opportunities that come with those. And thinking about how we can be helpful in those communities, and we're in a broader diversity of communities every day.
Anybody else have thoughts about that?
In terms of the program I had mentioned before, the Advanced Manufacturing Technician Program, that investment that we had made in that program, if you look at the companies that are involved, there are the Toyotas and General Electric and big companies that you would recognize, but there are actually companies that are literally 15 people big that are also participating. And the unique way this partnership allows that is, if you want to participate in the program, you invest essentially in that student that you're going to hire at the end of the process. And so companies, even small ones, are willing to make that kind of investment if they know they're getting really valuable talent in the end. And so, as we look at trying to scale things and create opportunities, a company like Toyota can come in and set in place some infrastructure. And if it's put in place in a way that allows folks with varying resources to access it, then even in a small area, even in a rural area, many of our plants are in very, very rural areas, and there are companies of different sizes in those places. They would have access to that kind of thing as well. And so I think it's important to think about creating that kind of opportunity when you establish these types of programs.
Absolutely. Well, so I know we've just scratched the surface on a set of issues. First, can we give a big round of applause to our panel for their time and expertise today? I will say on National Skills Coalition's part, I look forward to working with all of you as we kind of continue to dig into these issues a little bit more and hope to inform some conversations around this both here in Washington and maybe out in some of those states and localities where we think a lot of the implementation challenges still reside. So a quick thanks to a couple of my colleagues on the National Skills Coalition staff, so Katie Spiker and Sylvia Vallejo, who were instrumental in making this happen, and for Connor McGee and the Microsoft team working with Portia to make this happen as well. Much thanks for that. We're going to do a third session in this discussion series. It's going to probably happen in April, likely up on the Hill, specifically focusing on the challenges that smaller companies face within these issues, both in terms of how tech is incorporated and how they are working as part of these partnerships, perhaps with larger players within their industries, perhaps with other colleges and community organizations and workforce boards and others, and how it is we should be thinking about policies to particularly meet some of their needs. So I hope we'll have some of you back for that conversation up on the Hill. But otherwise, thanks so much. Thanks to our folks who've joined us online and Facebook Live. If you want to find out more about that future session or to watch this session again or the prior session we did, you can go to nationalskillscoalition.org/future of work. So thanks, everybody. Have a great morning, and we hope to see you again soon.